So we have here a tool that's been made available by the Wisconsin DNR. Very useful. It's got a whole bunch of information there and also the ability to do some of these calculations that will give you some metrics about your habitat. So this is the calculator. You see the calculator tab down here. This is where you would be entering your data. Before we get to this, I'm going to show you the behind the scenes. This is a spreadsheet that pulls in from other spreadsheets. Most notably this one called 2016 Wisconsin Plants. So this is, as you can guess, as recent as 2016, an updated list of species, plant species to be found in Wisconsin. So they have a species code, and that species code is a reference to the scientific name. So you'll notice that most of these are first three letters of the genus name and first three letters of the species name. And if you needed to refer back to get the correct name, you could always do that from this sheet on the spreadsheet. So Goodyeara oblongifolia is Goobl. And then they've also got common names. Lots of columns on here that are useful. The C value, the coefficient of conservatism, the wetland indicator status in the two regions that we talk about, the Midwest and North Central Northeast. And then I've actually I've done a couple modifications to the spreadsheet to make them even more useful to us. One of those is that I've added the number value for these. So if we have a wetland indicator status of facultative, that's a 0 in the range of -0 fully wetland to +0 fully upland. So facultative upland is a 3. Moving down, facultative wetland is a -3. This spreadsheet also has the native status, introduced or native, herbaceous, tree or aquatic or shrub. So those can be tallied up for you to help you decide what kind of habitat you have. Also special concern and other statuses. And then just a little off to the right, some little more specific naming issues there. There's some other tabs. There's one called Name Changes. This is if you were using the spreadsheet prior to 2016. This was a 2016 update, catch you up on some of the name changes that happened in the time since the previous version. There's a pretty extensive page here called Guide. You can walk through on your own. It's going to overlap a lot with what we talk about in our class, but if you wanted to get really specific to what the DNR does and recommends, you might want to visit this sheet on the spreadsheet. Kind of skip over this. This is just summary metrics, depending on the region you are, for what kind of quality habitat you have by all kinds of subdivisions. So really in-depth plant ecology stuff here. All right, so going back to the calculator, this is meant to have somebody collect the data and then turn this into another party, so you can record your site's location, county, your name as the plant surveyor, date that it happened. Probably good to get in a habit of doing that if you wanted to use this form. But the meat of what we're going to enter into is down starting in here. And we can see that you can enter a species code and percent cover. So going to our data from the prairie, pull this over a little bit. We could enter some species that were surveyed in that location, starting with the one that's most upland. So if you don't know the species code, you can do a pretty good job just guessing. You can capitalize them as they are in the sheet, or you could just do them lowercase works also. So ACH, MIL, Achillea millefolium, that's our first one at 10% coverage. I actually recorded these as number of individuals, but we're getting a rough sort of relative abundance metric on here. So in the size I was using of a 1 by 1 meter square, that's kind of realistic. Maybe 10 individuals is about 10% of the coverage there. So I'm going to leave those values in, but they were not collected as percent coverage. So let me just fill this in. Hey, pow. So notice didn't use capitals there, and that worked just fine. Loop, certainly easier for me not to hit the shift key. Poa pratensis at 50. Rud here at 2. Solcan at 5. And I'll rig at 20. So knowing your scientific name certainly gets you ahead on being able to figure out these species codes, but notice that it's also pulled over some common names. So if you want to know your plants, or maybe you already know them by common names, or you find those easy to remember, feel free to consult the common names. Just bear in mind what we've said about common names, that they might not be absolutely unique, and sometimes they can be downright misleading if two, say, distantly related plants have the same common name. Okay, so we've got a lot of stuff that is filled in here. Let me walk you through it. So most of this in this green and white area, this has been pulled over from that Wisconsin plants sheet, and contained in there we have the C value, coefficient of conservatism, the wetness value, and then the regional wetland values, Midwestern and North Central, Northeast, Wisconsin status of native or introduced, and so on. So up here it's going to calculate differently depending on whether we include or exclude the native species, and that's an important consideration if you're evaluating your habitat type. So you might have a fairly pristine habitat that's being invaded by invasive plants. You might want to sort of establish that habitat or evaluate the habitat without the non-native plants and see kind of what's in danger of being invaded there. Okay, so simple totals, number of species total, 7 lines of data were entered, number of those that are native, so notice 2 of them are called introduced, so the remaining 5 would be native. So of those 2, percent of cover made up by the introduced species, and then relative cover for all the, total cover and relative cover. So your numbers can add up to more than 100%, or sometimes even less than 100%. I suppose you could do these same calculations. A couple different panels of floristic quality metrics, including native species only or all species. The earlier versions of measuring floristic quality really just ignored non-native species. And there are 2 reasons why you might want to take either approach. So as I said, ignoring the invasive species can kind of tell you what the native community was like before it got invaded, and then including those invasive or non-native species, that can help you to kind of see how the habitat is now. So if it's a typically pristine habitat that's now crawling with invasive species, that's going to bring down your quality number, as you might guess. So lots of different tweaks on these. I don't know if I have a preference yet. They kind of go from simple to complex. So floristic quality index based on the native species, and then weighted floristic quality index. That's weighted by the abundance. So if you have some rare and some common species, and you have more of the rare species proportionally, then that can increase your value here, and we seem to be getting a little bit of that. So some of our more abundant species may be weighed in by this. Sunflower here with a high C value is one of the more abundant species there, as well as this stiff goldenrod, one of the more abundant species with a higher C value. So the abundance, relative abundance of Solidago rigida and Helianthus pauciflorus probably helping out that weighted value. Mean C value versus weighted C value, so kind of the same thing. Floristic quality index is a more complicated measurement, and then just the mean C value, you can calculate that by hand pretty easily. So native species, all species. The DNR had this feature highlighted, so maybe this is one to consider when you're evaluating your habitat. We were out on a prairie, so no trees, no shrubs, and no aquatics. This was the top of the ridge, and all of our plants, or 108% of the coverage, was herbaceous plants. And just over here, this is a feature I've added. I think it'll be useful for our class anyway, to take these wetness, wetland indicator values and turn them into numbers. So again, we can do a simple mean, which is what this is here. Mean of the wetland category if you're in the Midwest region. So you'd want to use whatever value applies to the region where you were doing your sampling. For the most part, we're in the North Central Northeast, but there's some curious bits in the Southwest and kind of around the Milwaukee area in Wisconsin that are still part of this Midwest region, and you might need to use those numbers instead. Okay, so 2.5, 3.0, numbers greater than 0 indicate that we are not particularly a wetland. Numbers less than 0 heading towards -5 at the extreme would tell us we have more of a wetland habitat. All right, so maybe let's remember a few of our features here. So not too spectacular on the C values. Overall, wetland values on the positive side. And let me just scroll over. I'm going to scroll over to a different point in our surveying and enter the values from those and see if we get anything different. All right, so Artemisia ludoviciana 30, Eryngium yuctifolium 1%, Penstemon digitalis 10, Ratibida pinnata 10. Notice it's filling in the possible names for these also, which is helpful. Solidago canadensis, again 20. Des 1%, and Traohiensis 5. Okay, so we've got a couple. This one called Rattlesnake Master. What an exciting common name. Comes in at 8 for a C value. Not too common, but useful to have in the habitat to increase our floristic quality. Overall, looks like these values are bigger. The floristic quality index. The weighted mean C value for the habitat still kind of low where we were before. Here we have the weighted values are lower than the normal, regular, unweighted values. And you can just kind of look at the data and see that sure enough we have our most abundant species has a low C value. Another one of our common species, low C value. So those just that you can just see how the numbers are affected by that. Wetness values were still above 0, so these would qualify as upland habitats. Maybe we'll go to the far extreme, maybe just before we got into the wetland, and see how that looks. So Possinum cannabinum 1. Sorry, behind here I'm using the M feature there. Asclepius raica 2. Runnecia 50%. That's going to be a big weight. Solidago canadensis down at 10% now, and Traohi at 5. All right, so pretty low C values overall, and only one of these species with more of a wetness indicator. Kind of interestingly, I guess, if you take these weighted values, which are not what you typically see, you get a weighted value that says this could actually be qualified as a wetland because of the abundance of the reed canary grass in that portion of the habitat. Kind of skews the value a little bit. So behind the scenes, this is the sheet that I've been using with our survey data, the species that were found and then their relative abundances throughout the habitat. So some of these starting at A, the more upland location, some species found only there, and then some species found only in the lower down, more wetland location.